At my husband's company gala, he laughed and introduced me as the babysitter in front of his entire company. People I had never met smiled politely, then laughed because they thought it was a joke everyone else understood. I remember the crystal chandeliers above us throwing warm light across the ballroom. I remember the sound of silverware against china. I remember my husband's hand resting casually in his pocket, as if nothing important had just happened. "This is Emily," he said. "Our babysitter." The table erupted. Someone nearly spilled their wine. A woman across from me covered her mouth while laughing. Another man leaned forward and asked, "Full-time or part-time?" Nobody noticed that I stopped breathing for a second. Nobody noticed that my fingers tightened around the stem of my water glass. Nobody noticed because they weren't looking at me. They were looking at Ryan, the successful sales director, the rising star, the man who had just made his wife disappear with a single sentence. What none of them knew was that before the night was over, a single conversation would turn that laughter into silence. What none of them knew was that my husband had spent years telling a story about me that wasn't true. And what Ryan didn't know was that someone very important was about to walk into that ballroom and say my name. Before I tell you what happened, if this story speaks to your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if this story truly resonates with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your country, and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who they find. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known you best, let me know in the comments. Sometimes those stories matter more than we realize. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and until that night, I believed I understood the man I married. I believed I understood the small compromises people make to keep a marriage together. I believed that if you loved someone long enough, they would eventually see you clearly. That night taught me how wrong I was. The gala was held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, one of those historic Boston hotels where every room seems to carry 100 years of ambition. The ballroom glowed gold beneath massive chandeliers. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Everywhere I looked, there were tailored suits, designer dresses, polished smiles, and conversations about promotions, acquisitions, and quarterly performance. Ryan loved events like this. He always had. As we stepped through the revolving doors, he adjusted his tuxedo jacket and glanced at me. "Just stay close tonight, okay?" he said. "Why?" I asked. He forced a smile. "It's easier. Lots of executives here." "I know how company events work, Ryan. I know." His voice softened. "I'm just saying," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We had been married for 4 years. I knew what he meant, or at least I thought I did. The elevator ride to the ballroom was quiet. Ryan checked his reflection in the mirrored wall twice. When the doors opened, he seemed to transform. His posture straightened. His smile widened. His voice became louder, more confident. The version of him that appeared at company events was always slightly different from the version I knew at home. More polished, more ambitious, more eager to impress. At first I used to admire that. Later I learned to fear it. We moved through clusters of employees and managers. Ryan shook hands constantly. "Good to see you. Congratulations on the account. We'll catch up next week." Every conversation pulled him a little farther away from me. I followed half a step behind, then 1 step, then 2. By the time we reached the executive table, I felt less like his wife and more like an accessory he'd forgotten to introduce properly. A woman named Melissa stood to greet us. "Ryan," she said warmly. "Glad you made it." Then she looked at me. "And who do we have here?" It should have been a simple question. Instead, Ryan laughed. Not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter. The kind of laugh people use when they're confident they've found something funny. "This is Emily," he said. Then he added the sentence that seemed to stop time, "Our babysitter." The reaction was immediate. Laughter rolled around the table. A man in a navy suit grinned. "Best babysitter in Boston?" Another woman said, "You must have your hands full." Ryan laughed with them. I looked at him, just for a second, waiting for him to correct it, waiting for him to say he was joking, waiting for him to remember that I was his wife. He never did. Instead, he pulled out a chair. "Sit wherever," he said. Then he turned away to greet another executive who had just arrived. I sat down slowly. The linen napkin felt stiff against my hands. Across the room, a jazz trio played softly near the stage. The music seemed strangely distant, like it belonged to another night entirely. "So, how many kids?" the woman beside me asked. I looked at her. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She genuinely believed what she'd been told. "None," I said quietly. She smiled politely. "Lucky you." I nodded. Then I looked toward the far end of the ballroom where dozens of conversations blurred together beneath the golden light. Somewhere deep inside me, an old familiar ache returned. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something heavier. The realization that the people who hurt us most are often the people who know exactly where to press. I lowered my eyes to the table. A text notification briefly lit up my phone screen. Just one line. No explanation. No context. The sender's name was enough to make me pause. "Jonathan, looking forward to seeing you tonight." I stared at the message for a moment, then locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse before anyone could notice. Across the room, a group of senior executives suddenly shifted their attention toward the ballroom entrance. The atmosphere changed in a way that's difficult to explain unless you've seen it yourself. Conversations softened. People straightened their posture. Heads turned almost in unison. Something important had just entered the room. Ryan followed their gaze and immediately stood up. His expression sharpened, his shoulders squared. He looked excited, nervous, hopeful, like a man waiting for an opportunity. I turned slowly toward the entrance as well, and the moment I saw who had arrived, I realized the night was about to become something very different from what Ryan expected. The room seemed to lean toward the entrance without anyone consciously deciding to move. It was one of those strange moments that happen in corporate America when power walks into a room and everyone feels it before a single word is spoken. I watched executives smooth their jackets. I watched managers set down their drinks. Conversations slowed, then stopped. Across the ballroom, Jonathan Mercer had arrived. At least that was what everyone else saw. What I saw was something very different. I saw a name from my phone screen. I saw a connection I had kept quiet for years. I saw a secret that suddenly felt much harder to carry. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something. That night did not hurt because of one careless comment. It hurt because it landed on top of years of smaller wounds. Wounds that never looked serious enough to explain. Wounds I spent years pretending did not matter. The truth is, pain rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time it arrives an ounce at a time. A sentence here, a joke there, a moment everyone else forgets except the person living through it. I met Ryan 8 years earlier at a charity fundraiser near Cambridge. Back then he was working his first sales job. He drove a used Honda Accord with a cracked rear taillight and carried student loans that seemed larger than his paycheck. We spent hours talking beside a folding table covered with donated desserts. He was funny, kind, curious. The kind of man who asked follow-up questions because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. "What do you actually want to do?" he asked me that night. Nobody had asked me that in years. I remember smiling. "Build something of my own. Then you will." He said it so confidently that I laughed. "You do not even know what I want to build." "Does not matter," he replied. "You have that look." "What look?" "The look people get when they are going somewhere. For a long time, he was my biggest supporter. When I started my consulting firm from a tiny apartment office in Back Bay, Ryan was the one carrying folding tables up 3 flights of stairs. When I landed my first client, he brought home takeout and cheap champagne. When contracts fell apart, he sat beside me on the couch and told me to keep going. Sometimes I wonder if that version of Ryan was the real one, or if the man standing across the ballroom now had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the surface. The changes happened slowly, slow enough that I missed them at first. After his promotion started coming, our conversations changed. Success surrounded him. Bigger accounts, bigger bonuses, bigger titles. The company became more important. Then the people inside the company became more important. Then their opinions became more important. One evening, about 3 years into our marriage, we attended a neighborhood dinner party in Brookline. A man across the table asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Ryan smiled and jumped in. "Emily does some consulting." The man nodded. What kind? Ryan shrugged. Nothing too exciting. I remember looking at him, waiting, expecting him to elaborate. He never did. On the drive home, I asked quietly, "Why did you say that?" Ryan kept his eyes on the road. Say what? Nothing too exciting. He laughed lightly. Emily, it was small talk. You could have let me answer. You are overthinking it. That became one of his favorite phrases. You are overthinking it. Every uncomfortable conversation seemed to end there. 2 years later, at a company holiday party, another executive's wife asked how I spent my time. Ryan answered again. She likes helping people. The woman smiled politely. That sounds nice. Nice. Such a harmless word. Such a small word. Yet somehow I spent the entire ride home staring out the passenger window at snow-covered streets and feeling invisible. I told myself it was not worth arguing about. Marriage requires compromise. Marriage requires patience. Marriage requires grace. At least that is what I kept telling myself. The deeper truth was harder to admit. I was terrified of becoming another broken family. When I was 24, my father died unexpectedly from a heart attack. One ordinary Tuesday, one phone call, one hospital room. Then everything changed. My mother spent years drifting through grief afterward. The center of our family disappeared overnight. Ryan was there through all of it. He sat beside me at the funeral, helped organize paperwork, checked on me when I stopped returning calls. He became my safe place during the worst season of my life. Maybe that is why I excused things longer than I should have. Every time he disappointed me, my mind returned to the man who once held my hand in a hospital parking lot and refused to leave. I kept believing he would come back. I kept believing this was temporary. Standing inside the ballroom, I watched Ryan laughing with executives near the bar. The distance between us was only 30 feet. It felt much farther. My phone vibrated softly inside my purse. For a second, I thought about checking it. I did not. Instead, I looked toward the ballroom entrance again. Jonathan Mercer was making his way through the crowd, stopping every few feet to shake hands. Around me, conversations shifted. That is him. He rarely stays this long. Did you hear about the new acquisition? The woman beside me leaned closer. First Gala? She asked. Not exactly. You seem calm. I smiled faintly. Appearances can be misleading. She laughed, unaware of how true that was. Then something happened. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Across the room, Jonathan Mercer stopped mid-conversation. For a brief moment, his eyes moved across the crowd. Then they settled directly on me. Not near me. Not through me. On me. He said something to the executive beside him. The executive turned around and followed his gaze. A second later, another person did the same. Then another. I felt my pulse slow instead of quicken. Because suddenly I understood something Ryan still did not. The secret I had protected for years was no longer staying hidden. And for the first time all night, I was not the only person in that room who knew exactly who I was. Jonathan Mercer was still across the ballroom, but something had already shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a storm moving over the harbor before the first drop of rain ever falls. People were watching him. He was watching something else. Or someone else. I lowered my eyes and reached for my water glass. The ice had nearly melted. Around me, conversations restarted in cautious fragments. Laughter returned. Forks touched plates. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Ryan came back to the table carrying 2 drinks. He handed one to me without looking directly at my face. "Having fun?" he asked. "Sure," I said. He smiled, relieved by the answer. Not because he cared how I felt, because he preferred peace over honesty whenever honesty made him uncomfortable. He loosened his shoulders and took a sip from his glass. Good. Just hang in there a little longer. Hang in there. The phrase stayed with me. Like I was enduring something instead of participating in it. Like my presence required patience. A few minutes later, Ethan Brooks joined our table. Ryan immediately straightened in his chair. "Ethan, good to see you." Ethan shook his hand. "Ryan." Then his eyes moved toward me. For half a second, I saw recognition flicker across his face. Small, brief, gone almost instantly. He looked away. Ryan never noticed. "Big quarter coming up," Ryan said eagerly. "We are optimistic." Ethan nodded politely. "I am sure you are." Then he excused himself and continued through the crowd. Something about the exchange left Ryan unsettled. I could see it in the way he watched Ethan walk away. "Strange guy," he muttered. "Always hard to read." I remained quiet. The band shifted into a slower jazz number near the stage. Waiters replaced dinner plates with dessert settings. Outside the ballroom windows, downtown Boston glowed against the night sky. Traffic moved along Boylston Street like streams of red and white light, beautiful from a distance, complicated up close. Ryan leaned toward me. "By the way," his voice dropped slightly, "if anyone asks what you do, keep it simple." I turned my head. "Simple? You know what I mean?" "No, I do not," he exhaled. "Emily, tonight is important, I am aware. These executives do not care about consulting details. Some of them probably do." He laughed lightly. "Trust me, they do not." There it was again, that assumption, that certainty, the belief that he understood rooms he had never fully entered. I looked at him carefully. "What exactly would you like me to say?" Ryan glanced around before answering. "Just tell people you work independently." "I do work independently." "Good. That is not all I do." His smile tightened. "Emily, what? Why are we doing this tonight?" I stared at him for a moment, then looked away, because suddenly I understood something I had been avoiding for years. This was not about protecting me from embarrassment. It was about protecting a version of reality that made him comfortable. A reality where he was the ambitious one, the successful one, the impressive one, the person whose career mattered most. A reality that became harder to maintain whenever people learned too much about mine. Across the room, Melissa Grant appeared beside a group of senior managers. She glanced toward our table again, then looked back at Jonathan Mercer. They exchanged a few words. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from recognition. Tiny pieces were beginning to connect. Ryan checked his phone. "I have been trying to get FaceTime with Mercer for months. Have you? One meaningful conversation could change everything." He smiled. "You know how it works." Actually, I did. Better than he realized. 4 years earlier, before Mercer Dynamics became one of the fastest-growing technology firms in New England, they had faced a crisis that nearly destroyed a major acquisition. Legal complications, public relations fallout, investor panics. 3 consulting firms had failed to contain it. One private team eventually succeeded. Ryan never knew much about that period. He never asked many questions about my work, and I never volunteered answers. Not because I was hiding, because every time I tried sharing details, the conversation somehow drifted back toward him. "How was your day?" he would ask. Then before I finished answering, he would spend 40 minutes discussing sales targets, leadership meetings, and performance metrics. Eventually, I stopped offering more than necessary. Silence became easier, safer, familiar. At the table, Ryan laughed suddenly at something another manager said. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. The gesture looked affectionate from a distance. Up close, it felt different. Possessive. Controlling. "There she is," he joked, keeping me grounded. The manager smiled politely. "That is important," Ryan nodded. "Absolutely. Somebody has to." Again, the implication hung in the air. Small enough to deny. Clear enough to feel. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth. White linen, perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle anywhere. Strange how appearances work. The cleaner the surface looks, the harder it becomes to notice what is hidden underneath. Then Ryan said something that changed everything. It happened casually, almost absent-mindedly. Honestly, he told the manager beside him, "Emily worries too much about work. I keep telling her not to take things so seriously. It is not like lives depend on it." He laughed. The manager laughed with him. My fingers froze around my glass, not because the remark was cruel, because it touched a truth he knew nothing about. A truth connected to contracts, confidential meetings, crisis negotiations, and one particular project that had changed the trajectory of an entire company. A truth sitting quietly inside my purse in the form of a recent text message from a man now standing less than 50 feet away. At that exact moment, Jonathan Mercer turned away from the executives surrounding him. His eyes swept across the ballroom one more time, Then he began walking directly toward our table. Jonathan Mercer moved through the ballroom at an unhurried pace, stopping every few feet to greet investors, executives, and board members. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They laughed a little harder at his jokes. They stood a little straighter when he approached. I had seen that reaction before. Power always changes the temperature of a room. Ryan noticed him getting closer and immediately set down his drink. His entire focus narrowed. "This is it," he said quietly, adjusting his jacket. "Maybe I will finally get a few minutes with him." I said nothing. The table seemed to wake up around us. Chairs shifted. Conversations paused. Melissa Grant had returned and was speaking with Ethan Brooks near the edge of the dance floor. Both of them glanced toward our table more than once. It was subtle, easy to miss. Ryan missed it completely. Jonathan stopped at the neighboring table first. He shook hands with 2 board members, exchanged a few words with a senior vice president. Then something unexpected happened. A woman in her late 60s stepped into his path. Her silver hair was pinned neatly above her collar. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades earning respect instead of demanding it. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Holloway, former federal judge, current member of Mercer Dynamics Ethics Advisory Board, one of the most respected legal minds in New England. I had worked with her during a particularly difficult corporate investigation 3 years earlier. She spotted me almost instantly. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile people use at networking events. A real smile, warm, familiar. Ryan was still talking. "If I can get Jonathan to remember my name tonight, that could change everything." He never saw Margaret begin walking directly toward us. Ethan noticed. Melissa noticed. I noticed the exact moment they exchanged a look. The kind of look that says something important is about to happen. Margaret reached our table first. Ryan stood up so quickly his chair nearly bumped the tablecloth. "Judge Holloway," he said, extending a hand. "Ryan Carter. We met briefly last spring." Margaret shook his hand politely. Then her attention moved past him. Directly to me. "Emily." Her voice carried enough warmth that several nearby conversations stopped. "My goodness, it has been too long." For the first time all evening, Ryan looked confused. I rose from my chair. "It is good to see you, Margaret." She took both of my hands. "I have been hoping our paths would cross again." Ryan blinked. "Once. Twice." "You know each other?" Margaret laughed softly. "Know each other?" She looked genuinely surprised by the question. Emily helped save one of the most complicated corporate investigations I have ever been involved in. Silence settled around the table. Not complete silence. Just enough. Enough for people to start listening. Ryan forced a smile. "Really?" "Really," Margaret replied. "Most people would have walked away from that situation." Emily did not. I felt several pairs of eyes turn toward me. The woman who had been asking about babysitting earlier lowered her wineglass. Ethan had stopped moving entirely. Melissa looked like she was trying very hard not to smile. Ryan laughed awkwardly. "Emily never talks about work much." Margaret tilted her head. "That surprises me." Then she added gently, "Although now that I think about it, humility has always been one of her strengths." Ryan did not know what to do with that answer. I could see it happening in real time. The version of me he had spent years presenting to people was beginning to crack. Not because I was exposing him, not because I was correcting anyone, simply because someone else had entered the story. Someone whose opinion carried weight. Margaret remained beside me for another minute. We exchanged a few brief updates. She asked about my mother. I asked about her grandchildren. The conversation felt completely ordinary to me. To everyone else, it clearly did not. Before leaving, she squeezed my shoulder. "Do not disappear tonight. There are several people who will want to say hello." Then she walked away. Ryan watched her go. "What exactly was that about?" he asked. "Work." "What kind of work?" "The kind you never seemed interested in hearing about." He opened his mouth, closed it again. Across the ballroom, Jonathan Mercer had been speaking with a cluster of executives. Now he was no longer speaking. He was watching our table. More specifically, he was watching me. Ethan noticed it too. So did Melissa. They exchanged another glance. This one carried a completely different meaning. Ryan followed my gaze and finally realized something was wrong. Not wrong for me, wrong for him. The confidence he had been carrying all evening began to slip. "Emily," he said quietly, "is there something you have not told me?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered with complete honesty. "There are a lot of things you never asked." Before he could respond, Jonathan Mercer started walking toward us again. This time he was not stopping anywhere along the way. Jonathan Mercer crossed the ballroom with the kind of calm confidence that made people move without being asked. Conversations softened as he passed. A few executives straightened their posture. Others stepped aside instinctively. I remained seated. My pulse was steady. Not because I was fearless. Because some moments arrive after years of waiting, and when they finally appear, they feel strangely familiar. Ryan, on the other hand, looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle while the pieces kept changing shape. He glanced at me, then at Jonathan, then back at me again. "Emily," he said quietly, "what exactly is going on?" Before I could answer, Jonathan reached our table. The group around us fell silent. Even the music seemed farther away. Ryan stood immediately and extended his hand. "Mr. Mercer, it is an honor." Jonathan shook it politely. Professional, brief. Then his attention shifted. His expression softened the moment he looked at me. "Emily. Just my name. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, yet somehow it carried more weight than any title in the room." I rose from my chair and shook his hand. "Good to see you, Jonathan." A few people nearby exchanged surprised looks, not because he knew me, because of how naturally we spoke to each other. Like two people who had shared difficult days and long conversations long before this evening existed, Jonathan smiled. "I was beginning to think you were not coming. I almost stayed home." He laughed softly. "That would have been unfortunate." Ryan stared between us. "You two know each other?" Jonathan looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course." Then he glanced at me. "I assumed she told you." I held his gaze for a moment. It never really came up. That answer landed harder than anyone expected, including Ryan. Jonathan studied me for a second before nodding slightly. He understood more than I said. He always had. Ethan Brooks appeared beside him. Then Melissa. The gathering around our table grew larger without anyone formally joining it. People sensed something important was happening. They wanted to be close enough to witness it. Jonathan rested one hand on the back of a chair. "How is your mother doing?" he asked. "Much better. Thank you. Good. I remember you were worried about her after the surgery." Several faces around the table changed. Small details. Tiny shifts. People were realizing this relationship extended beyond business introductions and conference calls. Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable. "You have known each other for a while?" Jonathan answered before I could. "Several years." Melissa smiled. "Longer than most people here, actually." Ryan turned toward her. "Really?" Melissa nodded. "Much longer." Another silence followed. Not awkward. Curious. The kind of silence people create when they suspect a story exists beneath the surface. Jonathan checked his watch briefly. "I still remember our first meeting." He looked at me. "You arrived 20 minutes early." I laughed. "I was nervous." "You did not look nervous." "I was." "Well, you hid it well." Ethan chuckled. "That sounds like Emily." Ryan's eyes moved to Ethan. "You know her too?" Ethan smiled. "Not as well as Jonathan does." "But yes." The answer seemed to unsettle Ryan even more. For years he had viewed my work as something vague, something small, something operating somewhere in the background of our lives. Now people he deeply respected were speaking about me as if I belonged in conversations he had never been invited into, because the truth was simple. He had never asked to be invited. A server passed by carrying dessert plates. Nobody reached for them. Nobody wanted to leave. Jonathan glanced around the group. "You know, one of the things I respect most about Emily is that she never takes credit for what she accomplishes." I felt heat rise slightly in my cheeks. "Jonathan, it is true." He looked toward Melissa. "How many times have we had this argument?" Melissa laughed. "More than I can count." Ryan swallowed. "What accomplishments?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. The instant it left his mouth, I saw regret flash across his face. Not because he had asked. Because he had revealed that he genuinely did not know. Nobody answered immediately. Melissa looked down at her glass. Ethan studied the ceiling for a moment. Jonathan's expression remained calm, not judgmental, just thoughtful. Emily has helped a lot of organizations through difficult situations, he said carefully. She is very good at what she does. Ryan forced a smile. Consulting? Among other things. Jonathan's answer revealed nothing and everything at the same time. I appreciated that. He was protecting my story until I chose to tell it myself. Around us, curiosity continued growing. The woman who had spent most of the evening making polite conversation now watched me with completely different eyes. A manager from another department quietly pulled out a chair and joined the edge of the group. More people drifted closer. Jonathan glanced toward the stage where the evening program would begin shortly. Then he looked back at me. "There is someone here who has been hoping to see you." My stomach tightened slightly. "Who?" A familiar smile crossed his face. "You will find out soon enough." Then he turned and nodded toward the far side of the ballroom. I followed his gaze. Standing near the entrance was a man I had not seen in almost 3 years. The moment I recognized him, I understood exactly why Jonathan had looked so pleased. And for the first time that evening, I realized the truth about me was no longer unfolding one piece at a time. It was accelerating. The man standing near the entrance began walking toward us with the easy confidence of someone who did not need to prove who he was. For a moment, I simply watched him. 3 years had passed since I had seen David Reynolds in person. His hair was a little grayer now. The lines around his eyes were deeper. But he still carried himself the same way he always had. Calm, precise, unshaken. David had spent 25 years leading major corporate recovery projects across the country. He was one of the most respected crisis management executives in the industry. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew exactly what had happened during the most difficult period of my professional life. Ryan shifted beside me. "Who is that?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Jonathan smiled. "Someone Emily knows very well." David reached our group and stopped directly in front of me. His expression brightened. "Emily Carter." He opened his arms slightly before settling for a warm handshake. "I cannot believe it is actually you." I laughed softly. "Good to see you too, David. You disappeared. I got busy." That is one way to describe it. Several people around us smiled. Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable. He extended his hand. "Ryan Carter." David shook it politely. "Pleasure." Then his attention returned to me almost immediately. "You know," he said, looking around the table, "I still tell people about that project." My stomach tightened slightly. "David." He smiled. "What?" "It is true," Ethan chuckled. "Now I am interested." David looked at him. "You should be." Ryan forced a laugh. "What project are we talking about?" David glanced between us. The hesitation lasted less than a second, just long enough to reveal that he assumed Ryan already knew the answer. The restructuring effort. Ryan nodded slowly, as though the words meant something to him. They did not. I could see it in his face. "Right," he said. "Of course," David continued. "I have worked with a lot of talented people over the years. Most are smart. Some are exceptional. Very few stay calm when everything is falling apart." He looked directly at me. Emily was one of those people. The group around us grew larger. Nobody announced it. Nobody invited anyone. People simply kept drifting closer. Jonathan folded his arms. Melissa leaned against the back of a chair. Even the executives from neighboring tables seemed interested now. Ryan shifted his weight. "I think everyone is giving Emily too much credit." The moment the words left his mouth, I knew he regretted them. Not because they were cruel, because of where he said them. David blinked. Once, then smiled politely. "Actually, if anything, she receives too little credit." Nobody laughed. Ryan's smile faded slightly. "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" David's tone remained friendly, curious, not confrontational, just honest. Ryan opened his mouth, closed it again. For years he had been able to dismiss my work casually because nobody around him knew enough to challenge the narrative. Tonight was different. Jonathan stepped in gently. "Emily has always preferred staying behind the scenes." "Exactly," Ryan said quickly, relieved to find support. "That is what I have been trying to explain." I looked at him. really looked at him. The strange thing was that I no longer felt angry. Earlier in the evening, maybe. Earlier in the marriage, definitely. But standing there now, surrounded by people who saw me clearly, something inside me had become quiet. Ryan kept talking. She never talks about achievements. She never mentions projects. How was I supposed to know? There it was. The first shift. Not responsibility. Not reflection. Deflection. David studied him carefully. You could have asked. The words landed gently. Yet they seemed to hit harder than anything else that had been said all night. Ryan laughed nervously. Come on. Married people do not discuss work all the time. No, David agreed. But they usually know what their spouse does. Silence followed. A long one, the kind that makes people suddenly interested in their drinks. I reached for my glass, took a small sip, then finally spoke. David is right. Ryan turned toward me. Emily, you never asked. My voice remained calm, soft. There was no accusation in it, no anger, only truth. Every time I tried explaining a project, the conversation moved somewhere else. That is not fair. Maybe not. I nodded, but it is true. He stared at me, looking for a fight, looking for emotion, looking for something he could argue against. I gave him none of those things. Jonathan watched quietly. Melissa watched too. Nobody interrupted. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. I thought you would tell me if something was important. I smiled sadly. I thought you would want to know. The words seemed to take all the air out of him. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a confident executive and more like a man confronting a reality he had spent years avoiding. Around us, nobody appeared interested in humiliating him. That was the remarkable part. No one attacked him, no one mocked him, no one tried to embarrass him. The truth was doing all the work by itself. Jonathan glanced toward the stage where the evening program was about to begin. Then he looked back at me. Emily, he said quietly, there is something I think everyone here should probably know. His expression carried the same calm certainty I had seen countless times before, and judging by the sudden tension in Ryan's face, he realized exactly what I did. The next few minutes were about to change everything. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The ballroom continued moving around us. Servers carried trays, music drifted from the stage, glasses clinked somewhere in the distance. Yet our corner of the room felt suspended in time. Jonathan looked at me before continuing. It was a small gesture, but I understood it. He was giving me one final opportunity to stop him. I did not. I simply nodded. 3 years ago, Jonathan said calmly, our company faced a situation that nearly cost us a major acquisition. Some of the people here remember it. Several executives exchanged looks. Ethan nodded. Melissa folded her arms. David lowered his eyes with a faint smile. Jonathan continued. What most people do not know is that the recovery strategy that saved the deal did not come from one of the large consulting firms we hired. Ryan's expression tightened. It came from Emily. Nobody reacted immediately. Sometimes the most surprising truths arrive so quietly that people need a moment to catch up. Then the reaction started. A raised eyebrow, a surprised glance, a whispered question. Ryan laughed once. It sounded forced. Wait, you mean she was part of the team? Jonathan looked genuinely puzzled. Part of the team? He paused. No, she let it. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Ryan stared at him. Let it? Yes. Jonathan's voice remained steady. The final strategy. The negotiations. The communications framework. The recovery plan. Those came from Emily. Nobody was looking at Ryan anymore. That was the first thing I noticed. Earlier in the evening, every conversation had revolved around him. Now attention had shifted completely. And people who had spent hours trying to impress each other suddenly seemed interested in a different story. Ryan swallowed. I did not realize. Ethan blinked. You did not know? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Melissa looked down at her glass. David turned slightly away. Nobody wanted to embarrass Ryan. Unfortunately, reality was doing that on its own. Well, Ryan said quickly, Emily does not really talk about work. That is not true. The voice came from behind him. Everyone turned. It was Melissa. She sounded calm, not angry, not judgmental, just honest. I have seen Emily try to discuss projects before. Ryan looked surprised. What? Melissa shrugged lightly. At the holiday reception 2 years ago. At the charity auction last spring. A few other events. She hesitated. You usually change the subject. Ryan's face drained of color. I do not remember that. David gave a small smile. That does not mean it did not happen. The group fell silent again. Then something interesting happened. The people who had spent years reinforcing Ryan's version of reality began pulling away from it, not because they disliked him, because facts are difficult to argue with when everyone can see them. One manager shook his head slightly. I always thought Emily worked independently. Another executive replied, Apparently she does. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Nobody sounded hostile. That was the remarkable part. Nobody was attacking Ryan. They were simply asking questions. Questions that had obvious answers. Questions he could not answer. Ryan looked toward me, almost pleading now. Emily, say something. I met his eyes. About what? Tell them this is being exaggerated. The request hung between us. I felt no satisfaction hearing it. No triumph. Just sadness. I cannot do that. Why? Because it would not be true. Jonathan remained quiet. David remained quiet. The others watched. Ryan exhaled sharply. I was trying to help you fit in tonight. Nobody responded. Even he seemed to realize how weak the explanation sounded. Help me fit in? I repeated gently. You know what I mean. I do not think I do. These events are complicated. For whom? That question landed harder than any accusation could have. Ryan looked around the table as if searching for support. Earlier in the evening, support would have come instantly. Now people avoided his eyes. Not out of cruelty. Out of discomfort. The version of events he was offering no longer matched reality. Ethan cleared his throat. Ryan, I think the issue is not what happened tonight. Ryan looked at him hopefully. Ethan continued. The issue is that you seem surprised by information everyone else already knew. Ryan stared at him. Then at Melissa. Then at Jonathan. Then at me. One by one, the allies he assumed he had were stepping away from the story he had built. Not because they were betraying him, because they were choosing honesty over convenience. Jonathan glanced toward the stage where the evening program was about to begin. I should probably get ready. Then he looked at me. Before I go, there is one thing I want to say. The room quieted again. Jonathan smiled. Some of the best people I have worked with spend very little time talking about themselves. His eyes met mine. Emily is one of those people. Then he turned and walked toward the stage. Ethan followed. Melissa followed. David squeezed my shoulder before leaving as well. Within seconds, the crowd began dispersing. Conversations resumed. Music returned. The evening moved forward. Yet Ryan remained frozen beside the table. For the first time since I had known him, he looked completely alone. And the painful truth was that nobody had done that to him. He had spent years building a version of me small enough to make himself comfortable. Tonight, that version had finally collapsed under its own weight. When the crowd finally drifted away, the ballroom felt larger than it had an hour earlier. The noise remained. The music remained. The speeches were about to begin. Yet something inside me had become very still. I sat down slowly and looked across the room. Hundreds of people were talking, laughing, networking, building careers, chasing opportunities. For years I thought moments like this were about recognition, about being seen, about finally receiving credit. But, sitting there beneath the warm light of those chandeliers, I realized I was tired. Not physically, emotionally. Tired of proving, tired of shrinking, tired of carrying conversations that should have happened years ago. Ryan remained standing beside the table. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. The confidence that usually surrounded him was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked quietly. I looked at him. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. Just honesty. I tried. His eyes dropped toward the table. "Not like this. How would you know?" The question was gentle, yet it landed heavily between us. He rubbed his forehead. "I guess I would not." Around us, people were beginning to move toward the stage for the evening presentation. Jonathan would be speaking soon. Melissa passed nearby and gave me a small smile. Nothing dramatic, just kindness. The kind that asks for nothing in return. I smiled back. Then I stood. Ryan looked up. "Where are you going?" "Outside for some air." "Can we talk?" I considered the question. Years earlier, I would have answered immediately. Tonight, I needed a moment. "Later," I said softly. "Not right now." I walked through the ballroom doors and into the quiet corridor beyond. The sudden absence of noise felt almost startling. Plush carpet softened each footstep. Framed photographs lined the walls. Somewhere far away, an elevator chimed. I followed the corridor toward a terrace overlooking the city. The night air greeted me the moment I stepped outside. Cool, clean, honest. Boston stretched beneath a dark sky filled with scattered lights. Cars moved along the streets below. The Prudential Tower glowed in the distance. For several minutes, I simply stood there, breathing, listening, existing without explanation. My phone vibrated. Then again, I pulled it from my purse. The first message was from my mother. "Hope you are having a nice evening. Love you." The second arrived a few seconds later. "Call me tomorrow when you have time." I smiled despite myself. My mother had no idea what was happening tonight. She was probably sitting in her favorite chair watching an old movie and drinking tea. The thought brought unexpected comfort, not because of what she was doing, because of what she represented. Home, family, the people who loved you before titles, before promotions, before accomplishments, before any of the things the ballroom seemed to value so highly. Another message appeared, this one from my friend Sarah. "Thinking about you. Good luck tonight." I laughed softly. Sarah never forgot important dates, never forgot difficult conversations, never forgot people. Real friendship is easy to overlook until life reminds you how rare it is. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked out across the city again. The truth was that the most important people in my life had never cared about job titles. My father certainly had not. Before he died, he used to tell me something whenever I became obsessed with achievement. "Emily, success is what remains after the applause stops." At 24, I thought that sounded poetic. At 33, standing alone on a terrace above Boston, I finally understood what he meant. Success was my mother sending a message just to say she loved me. Success was friends who stayed when life became inconvenient. Success was sleeping peacefully at night because you knew who you were. The ballroom doors opened behind me. I heard footsteps. "Ryan." I knew before he spoke. "I thought I might find you out here." I nodded slightly but kept looking toward the skyline. He stood beside me. Not too close. Not too far away. For once, neither of us seemed interested in filling the silence. "I embarrassed you," he said eventually. It was not a question. I appreciated that. "Yes," he nodded. "I think I have been doing that for a long time." Another truth. Another quiet admission. The city lights reflected in the harbor beyond the rooftops. Somewhere below us, a siren echoed briefly before fading into the distance. Ryan folded his hands together. "I spent years chasing recognition." "I know, and somehow I stopped seeing the people closest to me." I did not answer, because some realizations belong to the person discovering them. After a while, he spoke again. "I am sorry, Emily." The words hung in the night air. Sincere, imperfect, human. I believed he meant them, but something important had changed. A few hours earlier, I might have needed those words. Now I simply heard them, accepted them, let them exist. Healing, I was beginning to realize, does not happen when someone finally understands your value. Healing begins when their understanding is no longer required for you to recognize it yourself. Behind us, applause suddenly erupted from inside the ballroom. The evening program had begun. Ryan looked toward the doors. I remained focused on the city. Because for the first time in a very long time, my attention was no longer on the battle I had survived. It was on the life waiting beyond it. The evening ended the way most important nights do. Not with a dramatic speech, not with a perfect ending, not with everyone suddenly becoming who they should have been. It ended quietly. The ballroom slowly emptied. The music faded. People gathered their coats and exchanged final handshakes. Outside, Boston continued moving exactly as it had before. Traffic flowed through the city. Lights reflected across the harbor. The world did not stop because one truth had finally surfaced. And somehow, that felt right. Life rarely changes all at once. It changes in small moments that become impossible to forget. 2 weeks later, I stood backstage at a leadership summit in downtown Boston. The conference center overlooked the water. Hundreds of professionals filled the auditorium beyond the curtain. I could hear conversations, laughter, the soft rustle of people finding their seats. A young event coordinator handed me a microphone. 5 minutes, Miss Carter. I smiled. Thank you. As she walked away, I caught my reflection in a nearby glass panel. For a moment, I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me. Not because I looked different, because I felt different. Lighter, clearer, more present inside my own life. The previous 2 weeks had brought difficult conversations, honest conversations. Ryan and I spent hours discussing things we should have discussed years earlier. Some conversations were uncomfortable, some were painful, some ended in silence. But for the first time in a very long time, they were real. I stopped protecting him from the truth. He stopped avoiding it. Whether our marriage would ultimately survive was not a question either of us could answer immediately. Some things take time. Trust is one of them. But something important had changed. The pretending was over. And sometimes that is where healing begins. Ryan faced consequences too. Not dramatic consequences. Not the kind people imagine in movies. Nobody fired him. Nobody publicly humiliated him. Life is usually more ordinary than that. What changed was perception. People no longer saw him as the confident man who seemed to have everything figured out. They saw him as a human being capable of blind spots, capable of mistakes, capable of taking someone for granted. Some professional relationships cooled. A few opportunities quietly shifted elsewhere, not because anyone punished him, because credibility is built slowly and damaged quietly. To his credit, he stopped making excuses. He stopped blaming circumstances. He stopped blaming me. The last time we spoke about that evening, he said something I still think about. I spent years trying to be impressive. Then he shook his head. I never realized how exhausting that was. As for me, life became simpler, not easier. Simpler. I spent more weekends with my mother. We visited bookstores, shared long lunches, talked about everything and nothing. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected while trying to hold together parts of my life that were already cracking. I accepted projects because they interested me, not because they would impress anyone. I slept better. I laughed more. I stopped explaining myself so much. One afternoon, several months later, I received a handwritten note from Margaret Holloway. Inside was a short message. It read, "The strongest people are often the ones who no longer need to prove their strength." I kept that note. It still sits in a small wooden box on my bookshelf beside a photograph of my father. Sometimes I look at both and think about how strange life can be. The lessons we resist are often the lessons we need most. The things we chase are often different from the things that actually matter, and the people who truly see us are usually paying attention long before everyone else notices. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that being respected by others is never a substitute for respecting yourself. The moment you allow someone else to define your worth, you hand them something they were never meant to own. Your value is not determined by a title, or a paycheck, or a relationship, or someone else's opinion. It exists before all of those things and remains after them. If you are listening to this and carrying a similar kind of hurt, I hope you know something. You do not have to spend your life convincing people to see you. You do not have to shrink yourself to make someone else comfortable. You do not have to earn the right to exist fully in your own story. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop arguing with people who have already decided not to understand you. Protect your peace, protect your confidence, protect the parts of yourself that took years to build. Those things matter, more than approval, more than appearances, more than being right. They matter because they are yours. And if this story connected with you in some way, I hope you will consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts below. I always enjoy reading your experiences, your reflections, and the lessons life has taught you along the way. We often discover that our stories are not as different as we think. The core lesson is simple: never let someone else's limited view of you become your own. A year after that gala, I was cleaning out a drawer in my office when I found an old business card. The edges were slightly worn. The print had faded a little. It was the very first card I ever ordered when I started my consulting company from that tiny apartment years ago. On the back, written in my father's handwriting, were 4 words: "Remember who you are." I sat there for a long time holding that card. Then I smiled. Outside my office window, the afternoon sun reflected across Boston Harbor. The city moved forward. Life moved forward. And for the first time in years, so did I. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you remember that the people who truly matter will never need you to become smaller in order to deserve a place in their lives.